Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Makowski, and joining me today from the great state of Massachusetts is my friend Kevin Levin. Kevin, how are you today?
Doing great, Chris.
Excellent. And we're getting ready for the upcoming Emerging Civil War Symposium. Our theme this year is the cities of war. And I wanted to invite Kevin on today so we could spend a little time in Beantown, Boston, one of my favorite cities in the whole world. And Kevin is based there. And first of all, Kevin, you just have a good shout out for Boston?
Do I have a good shout out for Boston?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not really right now. I mean, usually it has to do with sports, and we can't really say anything positive about sports right now. I'm just hoping the Celtics come out of this whole trade season in one piece and ready to start the new year. So it's a low point right now, Chris. I'm not in that mood, to be honest.
I understand. I understand. I actually follow the Celtics myself, and after last year's championship, this year a little hard, a little disappointing, but
Yeah.
I was still entertained. I always give them that. I was still entertained.
Boston fans have a very, short memory. They just expect great things year in, year out. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
we'll see what happens.
Ever since the Red Sox, finally broke the curse of the Bambino, that's I think what kept Boston sports fans humble because they always had that. But they've had great success baseball wise, and so
Yeah,
with football, baseball, so
yeah,
there's a lot. Yeah,
that's
so.
right. That's right.
Well, as we're thinking about the cities of war, of course, Boston is the scene of one of my favorite stories and a story that Kevin has spent a lot of time with lately, and that's the story of the 54th Massachusetts. And Kevin, you're working on a biography on Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Tell us a little bit about how that project's going before we get into the story.
Yeah, so we're actually thankfully getting to the end of the process. I'm waiting for another round of peer reviews to come back, one reviewer. It's been an interesting process up to this point, but when you work with an academic press, they want to make sure you get things right, that you have feedback to work with to improve the manuscript. So I'm excited about having a chance to respond to one more round of reviewer comments, and then after that, it should be a pretty smooth ride to the end. And so we're hoping that the book comes out next fall in 2026. We were hoping spring, but what's a few months, and so I'll have that to look forward to.
Well, I know that you've really embraced that opportunity to just keep making the book better. So a
Hopefully,
delay is sort of worth it if the book's going to be that much better, right?
yeah, that's the idea here.
So what is it about Shaw that grabbed your attention? And we'll sort of use this as our segue into the story itself.
Yeah.
What grabbed your attention about Shaw that made you decide you wanted to spend time writing a book about him?
Well, after moving to Boston in 2011, I certainly wanted to wrap my head around a project that was sort of close to me in terms of location. I didn't want to have to travel all over the place to archives, and so luckily the brunt of the material that you need for Shaw specifically is here in Boston, either at the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Boston Athenaeum, and Harvard University, which has digitized all of his letters, including his pre-war letters, which are interesting. So you can access those letters online. He had beautiful penmanship, and they're fun to read. Even though, of course, we do have a published um, a collection of his wartime letters that Russell Duncan put out about 25 years ago, and so it was the fact that it was a local project. I thought that I could also explore Boston during the Civil War, and then, of course, this won't come as a surprise to anyone. I think for most people, at least my age, the point of entry for Shaw in the 54th is the movie Glory. So having, researched both topics over the years, I certainly have a sense of the gulf between history and memory in Hollywood, but it certainly was an opportunity to explore that even further.
It seems to me with Shaw that he's one of those guys most people have heard of, but enough time has elapsed since the movie Glory came out that maybe they don't have that Hollywoodized version of him as fresh in their head as maybe folks did once upon a time.
Yeah.
So that must be kind of a interesting space for you as a researcher to navigate because maybe you've got some fresh clay to work with.
Yeah, hopefully. I think you're right about that. I'm finding that fewer and fewer people have seen the movie Glory. I mean, it is over 30 years old. And so, if you saw it in the theater or at some point shortly thereafter, as was my case, we've just aged ourselves, right? But I think it is The movie is still available on streaming services, but I don't get the sense that it has the same level of popularity. So I think because of that, you have a chance both to enrich people's understanding of the subject who have seen it, and you don't have some of those biases to have to work against, in writing a biography of Shaw.
Yeah, it seems, if you look at some other figures from the war, people have their preconceived notions, and you're always kind of fighting against that tide. But
Yeah.
I feel like Shaw's a fresher slate, but still has some name recognition.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think we still tend to see him as this kind of within this abolitionist mold. And I think that has a lot to do with the trajectory of the movie Glory. And I think there's a certain element of truth to that. I mean, certainly his parents were committed abolitionists and reformers generally. I mean, beyond the issue of abolitionism. And Shaw for me is someone who is sort of struggling to figure out where he is on all of these issues. And so trying to complicate our picture of Shaw it was really my goal, trying to understand different motivations, both at the beginning of the war and then of course as the war progresses. Because most of us, if we do know anything about Shaw, it's the last few months of his life. It's after he takes command of the 54th in early February of 1863 to his death at the, basically at Battery Wagner on July 18th. That's an incredibly small chunk of his military career. He's in the military from the beginning, first with the 7th New York, the militia unit, and then of course with the 2nd Massachusetts. And so I mean, there was a lot I didn't know about that much larger chunk of Shaw's military career. And it really helped me understand the last few months of his life as a result. You really do have to explore that earlier phase.
Yeah. So tell us, who is Shaw at the beginning of the war, before hostilities have really broken out, before he's signed up? Who is this young man from Boston?
He's the son of a wealthy Boston family that moved to Staten Island shortly after he was born in 1837. A student of Harvard, but not a graduate of Harvard. He leaves in 1859 to work in the family business, a shipping business. His father actually had retired much earlier to focus more fully on reform issues, but the larger family still maintained business interests. And again, he moved to New York. Shaw moved to New York in 1859, New York City, and hated it. He is someone who is, as I suggested a minute ago, really trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life. He at one point contemplates moving out west to become a farmer. He thinks about joining the army at one point. He doesn't really know what he wants to do, and hovering over all of this, of course, is a looming civil war, a growing sectional crisis. He pays some interest in the politics of it all, at least if you just sort of, go by the content of his letters. But he is certainly someone who thinks the war will advance his career in some shape or form. He certainly doesn't, enter the war, as someone who sees it as a war to end slavery. I think he's much more in the mold of understanding the importance of preserving the Union. And, as you go through his first year and a half, you see how that evolves slowly. But, he's a young kid, and trying to make his way in the world. I mean, that sounds cliche, and is forced to deal with the Civil War, right? All of it.
Now, you mentioned that that juxtaposition between the war for the Union and the later abolition aim of the war after the Emancipation Proclamation, and we tend to kind of think about the Emancipation Proclamation as that big gear shift. But particularly among abolitionists in the North and in Boston, that was a war hope, if maybe not a war aim early
Hmm.
on. How
Hmm.
does that inform kind of the context in which Shaw develops?
It informs his parents, especially his mother, because his mother is watching events from their home in Staten Island. And she interprets military events in terms of whether they will lead to this eventual outcome, the end of slavery. She sees the war in, with in those narrow terms, right? Anything less is a war that is incomplete, is a war that fails to live up to its full potential. And so that colors the correspondence between herself and her son, Robert. And it's interesting because, as I suggested, Robert Gould Shaw is, he's very much, he sees the war from his small position, his tiny place within the army, and he's trying to understand the ebb and flow of events from his perspective, not always concerned with that larger picture that his mother is focused on. And so that creates a lot of tension between the two because, he voted, it looks like he voted for Lincoln in 1860. His parents are Republican. They support Lincoln, even though they have problems with Lincoln when it comes to the issue of emancipation. And so, you know, they're not fans of McClellan. He's, of course, a Democrat. Robert is. Robert actually, speaks highly of McClellan because he thinks that McClellan's job is to organize the army, find a way to use that army to, destroy the Confederate army. So he's seeing it in narrow military terms. And so his inability to see his mother's perspective and her inability to sort of appreciate his creates this tension. And it really comes to, it comes to a kind of peak in the days after Antietam, because of course, as we all know, Lincoln does issue that preliminary proclamation 5 days after the battle. And, while his mother and his sister and his father are celebrating it back home, Shaw famously responds, "Well, I don't see what good it's going to do, right? Wherever the slaves aren't freed right here, right? So, he sees it as not really having much of an impact. And I think what he's really saying is that it's not going to have much of an impact on how he sees the war and the importance of future military events. Now, that might be short-sighted on his part. Um, and this goes round and round over the course of a few letters, where eventually he has to, say to his mother, I hope you don't come to the conclusion that I don't believe that slavery is morally wrong. I do, but you have to understand where I'm coming from." And he says that to, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but you really see how this war divides a family that I think a lot of people probably assumed would have been less divided over this specific issue, again, because of, the popularity of the movie Glory.
Isn't that just absolutely so human though? Like mom and son have trouble understanding each other.
Yeah,
I mean, whether it happens to be the war or gosh, why don't you keep your room picked up,
that's right. That's right. I mean, he is, he comes across as a bit spoiled. And I guess that goes with having been raised in this family. He spends a couple years in the 1850s traveling Europe, where he goes to school before entering Harvard. So he's led a charmed life, and he has, in that sense, he has spent a good amount of time independent of his parents, often his own. And so I think he does, he enjoys his freedom. He wants to be left alone to a certain extent, and he doesn't want necessarily to be bothered by the kinds of concerns that are animating his parents and family back home. He has more immediate concerns.
Yeah, yeah. And not surprising considering his age. I mean, he seems
That's
like a
right.
pretty typical young man in that
That's
regard,
right.
right?
Absolutely.
Now, the situation in New York and just the atmosphere, a bit different than the atmosphere in Boston, a lot less of an abolitionist influence, although there are some. But like the politics are different, the culture is different, the mix of immigrants is different.
Oh yeah.
How does that stew affect Shaw?
I don't know. That's a good question, and he doesn't really comment on that. He's in New York for a relatively short period of time. When the Seventh New York, when he joins the 7th New York in early 1861, somewhere in that period, um, I don't, it's unclear how much time he spends training with that unit, but when they do parade through New York on their way out, in the days after Fort Sumter, they're going to be bound for Maryland, and then of course they'll be one of the first regiments to enter Washington D.C. It's overwhelming support. But of course, as you're getting at, New York is clearly divided politically over the war. There is a strong Democratic contingency supporters in New York City. Obviously, the kinds of economic ties to the South and the slaveholding class are really important in this respect. So he's, it's a good question, but it's unclear. I know that in 1863, during the New York draft riots, his parents are still in Staten Island, and they live in a tiny um, community of abolitionists, and they're very active. And so there is some concern that an element from Manhattan is going to, I guess, sail over to Staten Island and create some trouble. That doesn't really happen, but there are warnings, and people are concerned about it in the summer of 1863. So yeah, so New York is certainly, compared to Boston, a bit more, I guess, a bit more divided. Although Boston, of course, I mean, they have some of the same connections to the South as well, and a strong Democratic base there as well. So it does speak to the fact that the North is divided to a great extent during the war over some of these fundamental questions about slavery. He enlists as a private. I think he has ambitions of promotion at some point. This is only I think it's just a 30-day deployment when they do leave. But among the regiments, this is it pulls from some of the wealthier families in New York, and I think I think they see it as, at least before Sumter, as more a social kind of gathering,
Um,
right, opportunity than anything else. Although obviously, I think war is likely, in early 1861 with the secession of the Deep South. But yeah, Shaw seems to have found a home in that regiment. He writes a number of letters, once they're deployed into Maryland, and especially once they've arrived in DC. This is a regiment that, when they arrive in DC, the capital is largely undefended at this point. They make their camp in the Capitol building. They have fun occupying the seats of politicians, engaging in mock debate over the issues of the day. Shaw meets Lincoln, he meets Stanton, he has interviews with both of them while they're in Washington. So it's a relatively short deployment, and he has to almost immediately start thinking about another regiment, which is of course why he transfers over to the second.
and so, um, does he have like an epiphany moment? Does he have an experience in those early months, or even in that first year of the war, where he's like, "Ah, this is not quite the lark I thought it would be"?
That's a great question. And the answer is, as far as I can tell, no. He takes to military life. I think he enjoyed it. I think he enjoyed the adventure. I think he enjoyed the sense of purpose that he had been looking for up to that point before the war started. He's desperate for promotion. I think that is, if you want to understand Shaw in the first roughly 18 months of the war, you have to understand his desire for promotion. He wants respect, and he wants to command other soldiers. And he takes on a number of different positions. He eventually does rise to captain in the Second Massachusetts, but I don't think there's so much of a moment where anything clicks, even over the issue of slavery and emancipation. Remember, the Second Massachusetts spends a good chunk of 1861 and 1862 in the Shenandoah Valley. So as they're moving from places like Harper's Ferry down to Winchester, etc., they are confronting, hundreds, if not thousands, of freedom seekers, of fugitive slaves. He writes about them in his letters home, and I think his parents are enjoy, getting these letters, but he never makes the shift from writing about the experiences of interacting with these people, uh, men, women, and children, to seeing the war as specifically focused, its goal being, emancipation and ending slavery. So he never really, which is interesting because a number of historians have argued that by 62, early 63, you do begin to see a noticeable shift, in the Army of the Potomac when it comes to how they're viewing slavery, the issue of slavery, because they're experiencing it for the first time. And certainly Shaw, had experienced it for the first time directly, but he never really comes to some moment of awakening when it comes to emancipation.
Yeah. To me, I always sort of liken it to like when people see a tourist sees a buffalo at Yellowstone for the first time, and they're like, "Oh wow, that's cute," and they've known about buffalo, they've seen pictures, and so then they don't realize just how dangerous they can actually be. So it's like, I'm gonna come up and take my picture, but like they're sort of inured to the reality of it. And maybe with Shaw,
Hmm.
because his parents had been talking about abolition, abolition, slavery, 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 it's kind of something that's been in his head for a while. So when he finally sees it, he kind of already has an idea for it, not realizing like, the reality might be a little different here.
Yeah, that is interesting, and certainly with other, with some of his friends. Remember, the second is filled. The officer class in the second is filled with Harvard graduates and people of his social class, and so you find a range of responses over time when it comes to how they respond to these interactions, and so it's hard to compare Shaw because again, it's hard to generalize how these officers are responding, but like I said, he never really, um there's no clear shift in his thinking. And I should say also, in September of 61, there's a major in the second, Morris Copeland, and he starts talking about recruiting black soldiers into the army. He thinks it's a great idea. He's coming at it from more of an emancipationist perspective. He actually believes in the cause of emancipation, and he actually is able to convince Shaw to sign on to this idea. And nothing really comes up, as a result. But and Shaw never writes home about it. He never talks to his parents. He writes it to a New York newspaper editor asking his opinion about whether this would work, but he never writes home to his parents about it, which is interesting. But it's another great example of the way in which the war is forcing people along in a way in which they're not always aware of the direction they're headed. And I think that kind of gets at Shaw's experience. He's wrapped up in this much larger process. He's not alone in the fact that no one really knows where all of this is headed, right? That the war is spiraling, or is evolving in ways that few people could have anticipated in the spring of 1861, especially when it comes to the issue of emancipation.
Yeah. So how does he go from being in a New York regiment to deciding I'm going to go to a Massachusetts regiment?
Well, he has the connections to Boston. He has the connections through family to the governor, Governor Andrew, and he also has the option of some sort of promotion as well. Why he doesn't go with a New York regiment, I can't say. I suspect that it is because of his family connections to Boston. The Second Massachusetts was being raised at just that point, and so I assume it's you know people pulling levers behind the scenes that get him a commission in that regiment. But he leaves. He arrives in, I want to say, mid-June of 1861. And so it's a very direct transition from the seventh to the second.
And suddenly he's a veteran. He's had some experience,
That's
right?
right. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah. He's seen the Capitol.
Yeah. Shaking Lincoln's hand.
That's right.
So what is the second Massachusetts like as an early war unit drawn from the Boston area?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
who are
it's
these?
it's 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 really interesting because, like I said, you have an officer corps of elites, very much like the 20th Massachusetts, which is commonly referred to as the Harvard Regiment. And then you have your rank and file. And you know, Shaw does not, in his letters, he is focused on a couple things. The lack of discipline among this regiment. He is a strict disciplinarian throughout the first 18 months and into his command of the 54th. So discipline is absolutely essential, and I think that tells us something about, the transition of the or the evolution of the citizen soldier, right? Um, and it certainly has a contingent, a large number, significant number of Irish. And Shaw is not a fan of the Irish. He is very clear in his letters that he sees them as unruly, incapable of following orders. And he refers to them. I mean, you read some of his early letters, and when he uses the word Americans, he is not referring to the Irish. So, that shouldn't come as much of a surprise given the discrimination in places like Boston and New York with the increase in Irish immigrants coming into the country at that time. But he is very clear about his disdain for the Irish. And I think that tells us something important because when we think of Shaw, we think of the racial hierarchy between, an elite white man who's going to end up commanding black soldiers. But Shaw already sees the world around him in a strictly hierarchical way, right? Because he has always been taught to see himself as the upper crust, as someone who was born to issue orders and for others to follow. So you see that very early on in his letters regarding the second. Um, you know, the first year of the war, they don't see much action until the spring of 1862. They were supposed to be at Ball's Bluff. They're on their way to Ball's Bluff, but they don't get there in time. But Shaw sees a number of his close friends who are suffering or either, killed in action when the regiment arrives. But it's I want to say Second Winchester, early May of 1862, when they first start seeing actual fighting.
Uh, Now it's to me like Boston sending its sons off to war. Um, are these guys who are anxious to go? Are they excited in that early war fever?
I get the sense that they're probably not unlike the other regiments that are going off to war, um, given that none of these men has any idea of what they're about to face. I did try to get a sense of the vibe in the regiment from reading letters and diaries, and that's the impression that I get. They are traveling to a part of Virginia. Well, first they're traveling to a state they've never visited. They're experiencing, of course, they're confronting enslaved people for the first time, as I already mentioned, and they are struck by the landscape, the beauty of the Shenandoah Valley. I mean, you can read letter after letter. That's really the one of the common narrative ties between the letters of the men in this regiment, and I assume others as well. Just the beauty of the landscape, especially when they're encamped in and around Harper's Ferry. Some of those views are just spectacular, as we all know. Um, but the boredom certainly creeps in early on because, of course, the lack of seeing any military action. But that sense of adventure is certainly there, and that optimism, that strong sense of union, that I think is pervasive throughout many of the letters that I've read, from the Second Massachusetts. And again, I think that's pretty common.
Hmm. Now, the movie Glory picks up with the Battle of Antietam. So, there's several months where Shaw and his regiment are off doing the
Yeah.
war. What's his experience like before we sort of pick up with what we think we know about him?
The turning point, if there is a turning point for Shaw, it's Cedar Mountain on August, 10th, right? 1862. Um, he writes a number of letters in the wake of that battle, and he describes in excruciating detail walking the battlefield the day after and coming across his friends um, on the battlefield. He describes their faces. This is really, he sees a little bit of action in the Shenandoah Valley, as I mentioned. Um, Not much. This is the first major battle for him. And I think it it certainly leaves an impression on him in terms of just the sheer brutality of war, of these Civil War battles. He prepares their remains to be shipped back home. And I think it also, one of the things that keeps him focused in this regiment are the ties with his friends. And so they're already loosening by the time you get to the late summer, early fall, and especially in the wake of Antietam on September 17th. So between Cedar Mountain and Antietam, the regiment sees a good deal of action. Um, at Antietam, obviously, in the northern, that first phase of the battle, coming down the Hagerstown Pike, it's one of the regiments that pitches into Alfred Colquitt's Georgians in the cornfield. Early on, they support Sedgwick's um, disastrous advance into the West Woods. It's where a number of his friends are killed along the Hagerstown Pike as they're moving from the East Woods toward the Pike. So that's another costly battle for Shaw. And I think between those two battles, he has to think about whether or not he wants to remain in the regiment or take advantage of perhaps other opportunities to command that involve promotion outside of the regiment. And he writes quite a bit about this. Can he betray his friends? Can he leave his friends that he has gone through so much with in the second for another position? At the same time, as I've already suggested, this is someone who is desperate for promotion. He wants to see more of the war. He wants more responsibility.
Now, is he offered that opportunity because of those abolitionist connections of his parents?
Well, certainly the 54th will be one that is directly the result of his parents. There's no question about that. But other than that, not so much. He does have an opportunity to join a cavalry unit that's being raised in Massachusetts with a promotion, and for a number of reasons, he decides against that. And so I think, as 1863 opens, the regiment didn't see action at Fredericksburg, so they are kind of, counting the days in winter camp in Virginia. And I think as 1863 opens, he is really sort of thinking about what to do. And that is the moment, where his father shows up with the offer of command of the 54th from Governor Andrew here in Boston.
So the 54th, obviously led by the incredible Morgan Freeman.
That's right.
Tell us what this regiment is like, because I don't think people really know, other than, ooh, it's a bunch of black troops. But this is a pretty incredibly diverse group of guys who are joining for a bunch of different reasons.
Yeah. I mean, I think first and foremost, this is a great opportunity to sort of move beyond the movie Glory, which of course depicts the 54th as a regiment of former slaves, of fugitive slaves. And that certainly wasn't the case at all. And I think also people believe that, because it's a designated Massachusetts regiment, that they're all from Massachusetts. Relatively few are from Massachusetts, and that's for a number of reasons. First, you know, um, Boston's black community had offered their service in 1861 and were rebuffed by Lincoln and the Republicans for any number of reasons, right? We could talk about that. And so when they come around again with the opportunity to enlist, many of them just simply don't trust the government. Why should we run to the colors now? We already offered you our service. But it's also the population of Massachusetts. There just simply aren't enough black men of military age to fill 1,000 slots. And so there are men from New Bedford. There's some of the first recruits to show up, and from Western Massachusetts. But early on, the governor realizes that he's going to have to send out recruiters to a number of states. And so the bulk of the men are from places like Pennsylvania, some from the area around Gettysburg, New York State, Ohio, Canada. So it is a regiment. It's a diverse regiment just in terms of where they're from. They run the full range of occupations. And so we are talking about a regiment. Some of them can write, they can read. Some of them do have education. Certainly the majority are working class. That shouldn't be as surprising, especially those from urban areas. I think it's important to note that if we're talking about generally in the North, Black men of military age, the percentage that actually volunteer during the war is incredibly high. I think it's somewhere around 75%. That is an incredible number to consider. And of course, don't forget, we've got the Dred Scott decision hanging in the background of all of this. So the question of what the war will actually um, reward African Americans with, what victory means for for free Black men in the North, is very much up for grabs in 1863. So by the middle of February of 1863, the camp at Reedville opens, right? No, I shouldn't say it opens. It's being used since the beginning of the war, but it opens to the 54th specifically. And so they're coming in from all over the North, and they will continue to come in, through early April. The regiment will be there until the end of May before it ships out to South Carolina.
Now, why was this so important to Governor Andrew? Because I mean, he put in a lot of effort to make this happen. Um, uh, why does he go to such lengths to
Well,
be able to create the
yeah,
54th?
there's a wonderful new biography by Steve Engel that's well worth reading. And Engel, has a long history of pushing for issues surrounding abolitionism and also racial equality. And so I think he really does believe in this cause. And you know, he has a step up, whereas an advantage in 1863 because other governors are not as fast in sort of taking advantage of the Emancipation Proclamation and the authorization to begin to recruit Black men. And so what happens eventually is that other governors, including governors like Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania, they will eventually prevent, other states from coming in to take their potential Black recruits because, of course, all of these states have quotas to meet, right? And so it makes their job that much more difficult to meet those quotas. But Andrew's the real deal, and I think he truly did believe in this cause. And I think that's why finding the right colonel. Now, whether or not Shaw was the right colonel, given Andrew's values, is a question. But certainly seeking out a family like the Shaws, I think, tells us something about the emphasis he's placing on getting someone in command that he can relate to at that level.
Yeah. How does the 54th compare to other early recruited Black regiments?
Well, I think the obvious two to compare it with are the ones in South Carolina, so the first and second South Carolina. And they're being recruited beginning, roughly late spring, summer 1862, one commanded by James Montgomery, the first one commanded by Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And in that case, of course, we are talking about a regiment made up of formerly enslaved people. We're talking about two regiments that are taking advantage of Union occupation of the Seacoast Islands, which began in November of 1861. As you have thousands of enslaved people that have been working those rice fields along the coast. Their enslavers have moved away. Once they heard those naval guns, they got out of Dodge. And the question then, of course, is what do you do with this population that now has to survive, has to eat, we have to figure out, has to be productive in some way. And so that's how you get the Sea Island experiments or the Port Royal experiment out of that. And so early on, you have military governors, commanders who are trying to figure out how to take advantage of a potential military force, right, in terms of recruiting some of these men. And that's a long story. But by the end of 1862, you have those two regiments. And by early 1863, especially with Montgomery's regiment, they're out on patrol. They are, as far as, Florida, on various expeditions. And the most significant one, of course, is the one Montgomery leads in June 1st of 1863 up the Combahee River. Just as Shaw's 54th Massachusetts, they arrive right after that raid. So there's already a lot of action. And so you can see a kind of cultural gap between obviously northern born for the most part, black men and people who, of course, are coming right out of slavery. And so those differences must have been quite striking.
Yeah. And then, as the war goes on, the 54th keeps its state identity,
Yeah.
even after the government, sort of institutes the United States Colored Infantry. Why is that Massachusetts identity so important to them?
That's a really good question, Chris. I don't know, excuse me if you can hear Otis in the background. Um, I actually don't really know the answer to that
Yeah.
question. Why the fourth is able to retain its identity, because I don't remember exactly when that issue comes up, whether it was before Wagner or after Wagner, whether that would have been um, an issue. So I have to say I have to sort of claim ignorance on this one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's um uh
Do you happen to know? I
I
mean,
don't, and that's why I was, but to me, it's that sense of identity, which is so integral to so many regiments, and
yeah, yeah.
thinking about the leadership role that these guys had, kind of as one of the first regiments, the baptism of blood on Morris Island, those are all really strong reasons to just cling to your regimental identity like that.
I'm sure one of your listeners, readers will know, and they will put the answer in the
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
comments.
put your
So
answers in the
please
comments.
do, please do.
So Shaw has to learn how to be a colonel, and he has to learn how to be a colonel of colored troops, and he has to learn how to be a colonel of these specific colored troops. That's a pretty big learning curve, it seems
It
to me.
is. Yeah, absolutely. And here is where it gets, in my mind, really interesting because as was the case with the second, Shaw doesn't really comment much on um, individual soldiers. He doesn't sort of point people out beyond his fellow officers that he's enjoying Thanksgiving dinner with. He certainly, like I said, is worried about discipline, getting the unit ready, the regiment ready for battle in regard to the second. And the same is true for the 54th. What I found so interesting is how little time he apparently spent at Reedville. So he spends a good deal of time in Boston with the governor. There are any number of things that early on, at least, in terms of bringing new recruits in. He has to find ways to raise support within the Boston community in terms of raising money, uh, uh, getting folks to knit socks, all kinds of things that he thinks are necessary to get his regiment ready. So what he writes most about is working with the governor, going to these private fundraisers that he absolutely despises. He doesn't really spend that much time training the regiment. Now, maybe that is for a colonel not so surprising. I mean, perhaps the way to look at this is he certainly has his second in command taking care of much of this on the ground, and company commanders doing taking care of the training. He does, of course, keep track of what's going on, but he's not directly overseeing, as far as I can tell, on a day-to-day basis, what's happening at Reedville. And remember, the other last thing is he gets married right
Yeah.
before they ship out. He gets married in early May of 1863, which I find, and his mother especially, his mother was dead set against him getting married, both because, well, in large part because uh, she was a dominating mother, first of all. So I'm not quite sure um, any wife would be sufficient, good enough, fiance good enough for her son, but also it would be a distraction from his responsibility. And from her perspective, his responsibility is to command now a regiment of black men to bring about the end of slavery, right? So
Yeah.
again, there's that narrow vision on the part of his mother, but it does speak volumes, the fact that he goes to New York to get married, then he goes to vacation out to Western Massachusetts, where his fiance, her family lives, and I think he's gone for like a week and a half.
Mm.
So, and when he comes back, I think he's under the impression that he's still going, they're going to ship out to North Carolina at first. And then, of course, he learns it's going to be South Carolina. So, I don't want to say that he's an absentee colonel, but, if you're watching a movie like Glory, you're imagining Shaw making sure that his soldiers can fire 3 shots in a minute, right? As that
Right.
one scene beautifully depicts, but there's nothing along those lines that I can find that would even approach that kind of level of oversight.
Uh,
Now, that's going to be a little bit different, obviously, once they get into the field, but at least in terms of training, um, he appears to be leaving it to others.
and again, I'll kind of thread that path of memory and moviedom. But the movie also shows he's crusading for equal pay and making sure that they get all the supplies that they
Right,
need, and that's like,
right,
and
right.
and like any good colonel would do that for his men, whether
Sure.
they're white or black. How much of that is true, and how
None of
much of
it.
it is influenced by race or his character?
Yeah, the short answer is none of it. I mean, remember, this is Andrew's this is his project, right? These men go without nothing. They have uniforms on day one, they have rifles on day one, they live in dry barracks, right? Not those tents that we see in Glory. So this is a regiment that doesn't lack anything, right? And that is by design, right? Because of course it is still very much an experimental regiment. And I think Shaw is very much aware of that. The governor is certainly aware of that. And so you're not going to send these men into the field set up to fail because they lack training, or the materials that you need to become a competent soldier. And that ruins, of course, the entire project of recruiting black soldiers into the army. So that was never going to happen. So I think that part of Glory is Hollywood wanting to create a slavery to freedom narrative, right?
Right.
And of course, also dealing with the racism that was pervasive throughout the North, including Boston and even among white soldiers. Um, and so certainly they faced that. There are any number, if you read the Boston newspapers in early 63, observers go out to Reedville on a regular basis to get a sense of what's going on out there. And of course, you certainly do get, reflections of the racism, especially in Democratic newspapers. But more often than not, people are impressed. These men know what they're doing. They can follow orders, right? They can march in step. They can do all the things that white soldiers can do in camp, right? And that is obviously confirmed when the regiment marches through Boston during that famous parade leading up to their, sailing off to South Carolina at the end of May 1863. Although there are some incidents during the parade, overall or overwhelmingly, it is a positive response from the community.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we forget that even just the idea of marching in formation and following orders was a test for black soldiers, which today we would think like, well, of course they can do that. But that
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
thing, you know.
absolutely. Yeah.
Does does Shaw rise to the occasion if the 54th is Andrew's pet project? Does Shaw rise to that occasion?
If we're talking about, does Shaw embrace the same principles? Does he see the war in line with how Andrew and his parents see the war? I think the answer is no. Although I think there is, I mean, let me sort of back up a little bit. Again, I don't think there's any question that Shaw viewed slavery as a curse, that the nation would be better off without it, that slavery is immoral. I think he held all of those beliefs. Are those the beliefs that animated him as a colonel in terms of um, taking command of the 54th? Is that what is motivating him? Is that what is motivating him once they're in the field in early June of 1863? It's hard to say. There is no smoking gun. I have no doubt that Shaw evolved in terms of how he viewed the men under his command. Although again, he compliments them, after the skirmish on James Island. He does want them to see action. He wants his own reputation to be reinforced and vindicated for taking command of a black regiment. But is he someone who has come to embrace those principles in terms of what the war ultimately is about? I don't think so. I think we have to always remember that the Shaw of historical memory is one that his mother, after his death, was very much focused on creating.
Yeah.
She clearly took it upon herself after his death to ensure that his memories would survive, and also that that it would survive as a kind of within the abolitionist narrative, within the abolitionist vein. In fact, a great example of this is after the burning, the famous burning of Darien, Georgia, which of course the 54th was involved with, along with James Montgomery's regiment. After the war, and of course, we all know that Shaw was following orders from Montgomery. He was ultimately in command of that expedition. But after the war, a a preacher in Darien, whose church was burned down, published a piece in a magazine that blamed Shaw directly for the burning. And his mother found out about this and immediately published a response in Harper's. And of course, she published it. Make sure it's like one of the more popular publications. And she eventually started corresponding with this gentleman in Darien, and eventually was able to get a retraction from him, a follow-up published. But also, in the end, she eventually donated money to help rebuild the church in Darien. And so it's a wonderful example of just how far she will go to protect his memory after the war.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, do you think he would have been pleased with the way he ended up being remembered, knowing that, he was ambitious, trying to work his way up through promotion, and, he was definitely looking at that career arc comes to an untimely end. Um,
That is a really really good question, and I want to say that he would be, if the emphasis is placed on, his sense of honor as a as an officer, his bravery on the battlefield, the way he died leading his troops on the battlefield. Um, would it matter to him if that was framed around leading a black regiment or just soldiers generally? I'm not so sure.
mm,
Again, that's the gap between what I can interpret through his letters and the post-war kind of memory or myth making that we see. And so maybe I'm wrong about that. I just don't know enough to be able to answer that. And
yeah,
that is
yeah,
actually the space that I want people to be in regarding Shaw.
yeah,
As someone, I mean, his death is in the middle of the Civil War, the summer of 63. It's taken this shift from simply the limited war of Union to a much more expansive war regarding emancipation. But we still don't know how this is going to end. And so I think using Shaw to give people, using Shaw as a window into that broader sense of uncertainty was really one of my goals. That again, is Shaw is being very much carried along. He's making decisions, but of course, he's also trying to figure out all of the questions that Americans have in the summer of 63 about where are we going? Are we going to win this war? What will the results be? Right? What's the future of the country? No one really has any sense of that.
yeah, yeah. And I admit my question has an unknowable answer, but I appreciate what you sort of as you muse your way through that.
It's
That's
another version of that question that I sometimes get is, would Shaw have approved of Reconstruction?
uh,
And I don't, there is nothing in his correspondence. And I understand the question. That is our way of trying to bring him closer to the present and trying to make him or turn him into um, someone who is not just leading black men on the battlefield, but is also then leading the country into, leading the country toward racial equality. And there, I don't see any evidence of.
yeah,
I
yeah.
can't say one way or the other where he would stand on that.
Yeah, it sort of moves him from the military role into like the intellectual, one of the thinkers of
Yeah,
how this all puts together.
exactly.
So most people they know that he dies during the battle, and then like okay, the movie's over and the 54th just sort of evaporates, but the
Right.
54th continues on. Can you quickly just sort of summarize the rest of their experience
Yeah,
with?
I mean, they are stationed in that area throughout the rest of the war. They fight at a couple small skirmishes. They're at Alusty, right, in Florida, and so South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, roughly the same department, and they spend a couple months in South Carolina as an occupying force.
Mhm.
And if I remember correctly, they're brought back to Boston in December 1865. And you can still see their regimental flags in the State House, I believe. They're on display.
Yeah.
And and that's where they're mustered out.
Very good. There's actually even a historical marker in Point Pleasant, South Carolina, where they had been encamped. So you can kind of see
Oh,
that
I didn't know that.
that post-battle part of their story as
I
they're
did
there.
not know that.
Yeah. So, so as we get ready to wrap up, any final thoughts you'd like people to consider as they think about Shaw, as they get ready for your book, if they want to maybe go watch Glory again after listening to our talk?
I still think this is, I don't know if I would suggest watching Glory. I think there is, I still think that this subject of Black soldiers is still understudied to a certain extent. So I would recommend just picking up a book if you're unfamiliar, if your understanding of this subject only extends, to Glory. It's a great sort of entry point, but obviously there's so much scholarship to delve into. Just pick up a book and start that part of the journey. I think it's well worth your time.
Well, I'm looking forward to the biography when it finally does come
Thanks.
out next year, and good luck as you get that wrapped up.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Uh, Let me give one final pitch. If you don't follow Kevin, you can catch him on Substack with Civil War Memory. I read it every day. You do some great thinking. You challenge us. I just think it's wonderful stuff.
Thanks so much, Chris. Coming up on 20 years this November.
Wow,
Oh, yeah.
congratulations. Wow.
Appreciate it.
I'm Chris Mikowski for Kevin Levin. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.